Now, when doing a video conference, I think it's also a good idea to set a tone. And so I would say, as we're here, I would ask you to remain present. Leave your video turned on if you would. If you're in a quiet, thank you, Lisa. If you're in a quiet environment, you're even welcome to leave your audio unmuted. If it is introducing any echo or noise to the bridge, then ideally, please keep yourself muted. A neat little trick for you with Zoom, and you can try this right now. Hold down the space bar and you'll see that you temporarily unmute, and let go of the space bar and it remutes you, so you don't have to find that other control. So it's sort of like a walkie-talkie. Yeah, isn't that cool, Lisa? In any case, if you choose to go spend some time on Outlook or messing around with your phone, what we know about the human brain is it can pay attention to only one thing at a time. And so don't pretend to be with us here on Zoom, because you're not. And in fact, a lot of people find that they're cycling among applications. And if you are particularly tired at the end of this, it's because you are doing what we call serial unitasking. Humans don't multitask, we serially unitask, and it's exhausting. And so if you want a little better experience with Zoom, stay present. And I recommend setting this similar message with your teams, because we're going to be using a lot more of this technology as we go. Going to cover a bunch of topics today, but mostly number 3, business operations redesign in the rest of 2020. That's where we're going to spend a lot of our time, but we're going to cover a lot of different things, including what's going on in South Korea, Sweden, Brazil, Australia, because there's a lot to learn as we look around the world. And the bottom line is this thing that we're in right now is not going to have a hard end. And so we've got to get used to the new reality ASAP. Distance is going to be with us for some time. And so let's start redesigning the business now. There's no reason to wait. There's a lot of backup material, and we will do at the end of this, if we have a little bit of time and some people want to hang on, a quick Zoom tutorial. Even if you don't stay on for that, there's 15 slides in the deck that you can use to either review yourself or to do Zoom tutorials for other people. Bunch of other good backup material in the appendix. I think we should be becoming familiar not just with Zoom, but also things like Slack, Microsoft Teams, Splashtop for remote system control, taking care of ourselves with a really cool app called 7. Your athletic club is closed, no excuse not to exercise. 7 is high intensity interval training, under 8 minutes, no equipment required. So great app, I've been using it for years. First learned about it in 2013 in the well section of the New York Times. Now, we're going to talk today a lot about exponentials. By the way, if you have a question as we go, just raise your hand and I'll point to you, call on you, or feel free to chat something to Norma. She'll monitor the chat and can jump in with any questions. I'm not going to read the chat myself because you can't read and talk at the same time, but she can act as our main chat monitor. So exponential change, that's what we're dealing with this virus, SARS-CoV-2. But I want to back up and give you a different example of exponential change, because it's been around business for a long time, and we're going to see a lot more of this going forward. At least 10 different areas where we're going to experience exponential change in the next 10 years. In fact, that's what we'd be talking about today were it not for COVID-19. Now, back in 1975, Kodak engineer Steve Sasson was invited to demonstrate the world's first digital camera for the Kodak board of directors. Be still, everybody, 23 seconds to capture an image. We will record it, state-of-the-art technology, cassette tape storage, and then I will reveal for you my amazing 0.01 megapixel image. Now, at this point in the demonstration, things tend to go off track because one of the board members looking at 0.01 megapixels recognized this is nowhere close to commercialization and asked Mr. Sasson, how long is this going to take to be acceptable instead of analog film technology? Well, Steve Sasson understood about exponentials, but maybe didn't understand that the board didn't. And so he knew 2 things. He knew, number 1, he had already done the experimentation. Somewhere around 2 megapixels, this would be good enough and consumers would accept the trade-off. Pretty good prediction based on the history we now know. On this linear scale, 2 megapixels would be 10 times higher. So you're just seeing the bottom of the scale. The other thing Steve Sasson knew was he had a doubling time. That's what defines an exponential. If you can double at a fixed period, that's an exponential. So he knew he could get from 0.01 to 0.02 within 2 years. And now in front of the board, he's trying to answer this question. And so he's thinking, well, by 1979, I can be at 0.04, 0.08, I can be at 0.16 by 1983. Now the board is looking at this and bringing linear thinking. And so they're saying, Mr. Sasson, you have gone less than 10% of the way there in 8 years. 80 years, not only are we all retired, we're all dead. What are we talking about? Well, I'm going to rescale this now. Still a linear graph, so you can see where we are progressing after 8 years. And I guess you could be forgiven not understanding exponentials for thinking we're less than 10% of the way there. Steve, who understands exponentials, is thinking that we're more than 50% of the way to the goal. Now, there's a different kind of graph we're going to look at today for dealing with exponentials. And here it is. It's called not a linear graph, which is what you're seeing right now, but a logarithmic graph. And the one interesting characteristic of logarithmic graphs is when you plot an exponential on this graph, if it's a straight line, you're confirming the exponential behavior. Now that's going to be important in a minute when we look at COVID-19 around the world. Straight line versus bending curves. And so Steve is thinking, I got to get to 2 megapixels. I'm already, as you can see, 53% along the journey. I've only got 47% to go. And so what he was trying to explain was completely misinterpreted by the board. Kodak, for either that misunderstanding or to protect their existing business as it was, decided to pass. Fat, dumb, and happy, we've got a beautifully integrated, chemicals, paper, film, developing. What do we want to mess with a good thing? And of course, if you don't disrupt your own business, somebody else will. The world's most valuable brand was bankrupt by 2012. Now, I want to give you a process, and we're going to loop back a lot on exponentials today since we've got this virus. Looking ahead, here is a process. It's 3 simple steps, and you're going to want to do this with your team after today. Number 1, you start talking with the team about potential future scenarios, brainstorming, just collecting ideas. Collect up the ideas without being too judgy, and then look at your list and decide which ones are most important, positively or negatively impactful to the business, and then change up the discussion. Assume that that thing has happened at a specific point in time. Put yourself mentally at that point in time and talk about, okay, it's now X date, this thing has happened, what are the implications? Now we're going to do this as a group exercise in a second with the year 2025, but you can use it for next week. You can use it to vision next quarter, second half of this year. So you're going to find this a very flexible process. Once you start talking about implications, very quickly you see opportunities and threats, and you can choose which to address. So I'm going to give you a scenario. I'm going to ask you to participate. Here's the scenario. I'm broadcasting to you today from Pittsburgh. We are the worldwide headquarters of autonomous vehicle research. We've had autonomous Ubers for approaching 4 years in our city, dating back to fall of 2016. And after Uber unleashed its vehicles, then 4 other companies came to town. So on any given day, we've got dozens and dozens of autonomous vehicles moving around Pittsburgh. Right now, there's a rule. If you're offering service, it has to be free. And of course, because software is not yet perfect, there has to be a human in the vehicle to intervene. And so that's where we are in Pittsburgh. I look at how this is progressing. I think 2025 is a reasonable goal. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing for a second, and I'm going to ask, what are the implications of this? So it's 2025. Look outside your window. All those vehicles you can see, those are autonomous vehicles moving around without drivers. Give me one implication of that world, if you would. Put yourself in that year. COVID is 5 years in the past. What is one implication of autonomous vehicles being everywhere? And again, you can use the space bar to walkie-talkie or Zoom.
Somebody hits me, who do I sue?
Ah, interesting question, Gene. There will be some accidents, but far fewer than today. So today we lose about 40,000 people in the US, 1 million people worldwide, let alone tens of millions of injuries. Those numbers are going to start to drop. But to specifically answer your question, I don't think there are by and large individuals that own these fleets. And so you're going to sue a fleet owner. Other implications?
Quite a
Go
very
for it, Alejandro, and then we'll get to Marlon.
uh,
Yeah, hold down the space bar. Keep pressing it.
I'll keep pressing it. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm thinking about the Uber drivers and all the people that are gonna go without a job.
Exactly, exactly. And so it turns out that if you look at Uber's revenues today, fully 75% of their revenues are passing through to the drivers. There are no drivers in the future of Uber. And so this technology, which is already pretty inexpensive with Uber, is going to be even less so. So very few of us are going to choose to own cars. And there's probably more compelling economics to have an autonomous 18-wheeler, because humans have this strange behavior where we like to sleep at least 8 hours a day and we prefer to drive in the daylight. Computers don't care. So a computer piloted 18-wheeler is going to move close to 24/7. We can spread the traffic load, get the cost of the driver out of the system, far better capital utilization. So transportation costs are also going down fast. Marlon, what was your observation?
Yeah, to continue on Alejandro's point, it's going to have unprecedented both ways economic impact. From the unemployment, starting from the unemployment aspect, all the way to additional government regulation. Take New York City. There will be additional taxes and regulations pertaining to the TLC. Rest assured, I know what I'm talking about. So driving itself is a hobby for millions and millions of people around the world who buy sports cars. They do not buy sports cars to go from point A to point B. They drive to enjoy them.
Yes, and certainly the richest of us will choose to do that. Those that are maybe not as economically well off might occasionally schedule to go to a local track to drive something, but most of us won't own vehicles anymore. Or if we do, I anticipate owning a Tesla Model 3, but I'll still check it into the fleet so it can go out there and make money for me when I'm not using it. And the total cost of ownership on that Tesla is going to be lower than any car I've ever owned. But to your opening point, the number one job for men in this country is driving something. In some states, as much as 5% of employment, and by and large, good paying jobs for people who aren't necessarily highly educated. What happens to them? That's going to have all sorts of ripple effects through our society. And if we looked a little past 2025 to maybe 2035, we'd find that US unemployment stands around 50% because technology destroys jobs. It's not so much the threat of offshoring or immigration or outsourcing, it's technology. Okay, give me another implication of this world. Go ahead, Lisa, and then we'll get to Philippe if he's got one. Lisa.
All kinds of free time for the people who are using cars to commute right now. So either their bosses will exploit it for work, or they can read and listen to podcasts or go shopping.
Exactly. And so think about that. Essentially, as soon as I'm in my car, I could be productive at work, which means that I may choose to live in a less expensive area that's farther away from the office. By the way, we're going to be telecommuting a lot more by then too, but even for coming into the office, I jump into my car, ride 90 minutes, I'm working the whole time. Going home, ride 90 minutes, I'm working the whole time. And so this is going to take cost pressure out of residential housing in the major cities. Also, for those people that construct residential housing, they no longer have to make provision for parking, at least not very much parking, which is another cost factor coming out of residential construction in your city and mine. Other implications. Jump in, Kristen, and then we'll get Philippe. Kristen, then Philippe.
How will this impact mass transit, right? Now you don't have to be bound to a schedule. You can call a car on demand.
Absolutely. Anything I want, anywhere I want, whenever I want. And so I suspect that it will deload mass transit. And right now, the city authorities in Oregon are deciding whether to spend $1 billion on a new light rail system for Portland. Better have a pretty good vision of the future and what that looks like before you decide to commit that $1 billion. Philippe, what was one of yours?
I was thinking about the opportunity to completely rethink the way we commute and the way we have it done in cities or between cities. Because we're talking about cars, but it should apply to bus, subway, maybe train as well in the future. So certainly a shift in job and employments and competency that are needed, but also probably less traffic. new style of cars. We don't need a steering wheel and we don't need a driver's seat, so we can have a different concept, a different kind of car. So maybe more often and smaller, or bigger and a special route just for those. We may have some regulation to have all those new type of cars be electrical and better for the environment. So whatever option.
Yeah, so a lot to talk about there. We'll then end with Marlon and Kevin with the last two, but just to touch on a few things. If these are fleet-owned vehicles, I'm sure somebody at each of those companies, some Excel jockey, is going to walk into the boss one day and say, hey, look what I figured out with my spreadsheet. Electric vehicles are 30 to 40% less expensive to operate because they don't lose a lot of energy through heat. They regenerate electricity through braking. And, oh, by the way, they've got 1% as many parts as an ICE internal combustion engine vehicle. And so the service life is likely to be closer to 1 million miles than 250,000 miles. And so we're going to see a very dramatic sweep towards electrification because of the fleet ownership. With respect to special lanes, now think about human drivers. Remember how we all learned to keep a 2-second separation? If you do the math, with 3,600 seconds in an hour, a lane of traffic can move about 1,800 human piloted vehicles. In practice, it never hits that because we don't maintain perfect spacing. If you have a computer-driven vehicle, 0.2 of a second is forever, infinity. And so you could conceivably stack not 1,800, but 18,000 vehicles per hour per lane of traffic. So the HOV lanes will likely be repurposed and won't permit human drivers, but you'll see trains of vehicles moving very close together. And with respect to the design of the vehicle, what's to say I couldn't exercise on the way to work by scheduling an exercise vehicle? Or if I need to be in Chicago tomorrow from New York today, schedule a sleeper vehicle and ride overnight as I'm sleeping instead of taking short haul aircraft. All right, so let's go to just 2 final comments. Chime in. Marlon, were you one? I'm sorry, I lost track of who.
Yes. I just said for a second, you know, as a side note, you know, one of my clients is a law firm. It's a European law firm, and it's an interesting topic that you brought up. You know, technology is advancing, and it's all great and sounds fantastic, truly, for us. But at least in Europe, European governments would not allow it to happen in the foreseeable future at all, for the sake of saving jobs. For sure, and I'm talking about the Italian government, not sure about the Portuguese government for sure. But we're talking about very similar thing. Said they will not allow it.
Okay, so
plain and simple. They do not even allow Uber in you know, still few European countries. Plain and simple, forbidden.
Okay, so Mr. European politician, I've got a quick question for you. You'd rather save 1 million jobs?
It's not me.
1 million lives. 1 million lives.
It's not me. I'm not a
No.
politician.
I'm role playing. I'm role playing.
Yeah.
But the politicians that want to save jobs are trading off lives, and that's a pretty tough trade-off, right? 1 million humans a year, and we have the potential to reduce that by 99-point-something%. And so preserve jobs by killing people. Yeah, that sounds like a real good political platform. I just pointed out there are some very tough decisions. If you want
I know, but politicians do not think like you and I, unfortunately.
Yeah, but we're going to bring up the issue to them. All right, who had the closing comment?
I just had one quick thing. The amount of real estate that you could give back based on people not parking their unused cars.
1/3 of the traffic, 1/3 of street capacity in any major city.
But even just, you know, the Lowe's parking lot, the Home Depot parking lot, the amount of real estate that you could free up or that you would no longer need, so you could free up even the roads themselves. Parking spaces can be turned into walkways.
Bike lanes, exactly.
Yeah, right. So just that, I mean, if somebody did a study on sinking the FDR underground and the cost for that compared to how much money they would make by selling the land on top of the sunken FDR, it was like 2 times as much profit as it would be to actually construct the highway. Yeah. So it'd be just interesting to see how much, you know, the developers or the people who own real estate would want to do something like that.
Right, exactly. Let's see if I can go back to screen sharing there and resume the presentation. So I'm going to suggest this process. This 3-step process is useful right now to vision, you know, maybe next week, next month, next quarter. So you pick a date, your business has made it through, that's part of the scenario. Some of your competitors are gone. Some of your customers are gone, so there's good and bad. Maybe even some of your employees have departed. And what else? Be very specific, and then have the discussion with your team. What are the implications when you do this with lots of people? Notice how so many ideas came up that each of us contributed. It starts to open up the vision of potential opportunities or threats. That's a process for you going forward. So look back to this later. We're going to take a break, by the way, at about 5 minutes too. So let's go 20 minutes longer, and then we'll break. I think as a best practice, don't run Zoom for more than an hour. It's tiring. So a few disclosures for you. You're probably going to wonder where I'm coming from politically. I'm going to try to take it down the middle by the numbers, so I hope it doesn't show, but just so you know, so you're not wondering, registered Republican, have been for a long time. Today we're going to talk about some numbers, and those numbers are going to be known cases. I'm acknowledging right up front with COVID-19, we don't have, especially in this country, very good test coverage yet. Actual cases, totally different number. By the way, as of yesterday, I looked at where we stood, just over 1 million known cases, 56,000 deaths, 139,000 recovered. In other words, about 20% of these million have been resolved. And what strikes you as really weird when you look at the statistics compared to what we know is that saying of the resolved cases, about 29% died. Well, that tells us something else, that there's a lot more people out there. And so we know if we took total deaths by all resolved cases, those that were dead, those that were recovered, those that were unknown, according to WHO, we've got about a 2% mortality rate. Well, you've got the deaths number, you can plug that in. You've got the recovered number, you can plug that in. And when you have only one variable, you can solve for it. And if you do the math there, and this is just a rough estimate, but it says that we've got about 14.5 times more cases out there than we know. This is the only time today I'm going to comment on that, and that's just a very rough number. It's probably higher because there are some deaths in the unknown resolve because we haven't tested all people that died. In fact, I read this morning New York City is estimating about 5,000 more people who died. It was actually due to COVID-19. And so we've got far more actual cases out there. Now, the only thing I'm going to say in closing this particular point is our testing coverage hasn't changed very much. So I think that by working against known cases, we're not going to mislead ourselves. But I'm acknowledging that dramatic difference out there. That's one method. It's a rough estimate. We're going to have better data coming out of New York City statistical analysis, Telluride, Colorado antibody study, and so soon we're going to have a really good handle on that number. Okay, so enough said about actual cases. The rest of today is known cases. And then finally, if you hate numbers and graphs, just log on to the Vistage speaker rating site right now and put in 3 ones because this is going to be highly numerical. But here's why. None of us alive today was ever alive during a global pandemic. 100 years ago it happened, so we're going to go back and look and learn. But numbers can help us build more reliable models. Those models can help us make better decisions. And so that's why we're working with the numbers. Now, I want to lay out for you my conclusion straight away. I have concluded that with high probability during the remainder of 2020, now I want to point out just a few of those words. I have concluded. I'm not really looking for you to believe me. Instead, I'm going to take you on the tour I went on numerically. You draw your own conclusions. And so I have concluded. Also, when one attempts to predict the future, it is never with certainty. So I'm saying high probability. I'm not even saying a percentage, but high probability, but guaranteed could be wrong. And there's 5 different things that could happen that would break this. And I'm going to give you those assumptions. Those would all be good things. They're not necessarily under human control, but if they happen, everything just got easier. But here's my conclusion. I do not believe the kids are going to return to traditional K-12 classrooms. I don't mean this spring, I mean next fall. And I don't see the college students going back onto traditional campuses and traditional dorms. Child care center is not going to be open. Stadium bands will not tour for the rest of this year. NFL, my guess is they find a way to play, But if there's anyone in that stadium, it'll be limited to something small like 10%. There won't be any traditional campaign rallies. Traditional bars and restaurants are not going to be serving very many people inside. Maybe not any people inside. We'll see if we can figure that one out. Broadway's not going to reopen, at least not in the current theaters. Weddings and funerals, they'll go on, but relatively smaller affairs. Airlines not going to use center seats, unless, of course, everybody is wearing PPE, N95 grade masks. Movie theaters won't be open. In-home childcare will be a growth industry. And finally, on the other side, many people are going to have valuable new technology skills that allow them to operate virtually and at distance, and that's going to bring productivity gains and cost savings to our business. Now, before I go further, there was one underlying element here that is common across this list. Does anyone see what my underlying element was to all of these things? What ties them together?
Social distancing.
Yeah, social distancing, right? You can't go back with humans in high density because we're probably not going to have a vaccine. Look what happened in the first 78 days of this thing in our country, starting with just one case in one state, and then running 60 days without social distancing. We end up with 365,000 cases and a number that still is looking like it's going up quickly. Now, we do know that there was a second entry point, and that was your fair city. The Europeans who had gotten it through tracing all the way back to Wuhan, we can now do genomic testing. And so we see a lot of Europeans brought it into New York, but that was quite a bit later. So January 20th, Washington State, Wuhan traveler, 365,000. If we had not implemented social distancing at 60 days, there's the curve. I'm going to show you the numbers that back this up. Still looks sort of the same. The thing is, the height is different, 6.5 million. That crushes the US national medical system. Now, when we look at this thing, clearly the starting date is different in different cities, states, and countries. The doubling time is a little different depending on density of people, but the pattern is the same everywhere. The thing doubles at some given period. I'm going to take you around the world to show you that that's true. In other words, we have an exponential, and viruses are exponential. So this one isn't different in material ways than any other ones, other than it has different starting dates and different doubling times. Now, back to reality. We're going to talk about other exponentials in the future, like the problem with the exponential growth of data traffic on your phone. So we're going to do exponentials more another day, but that's for another day. Now, back to reality. I think we should forgive people for misunderstanding exponentials. Our brains have very little experience outside of the linear world. And so what people do is something like this. Well, 67 days from January 20th, 100,000 cases, 2% mortality rate, 2,000 potential deaths by the time those cases are resolved. What's the big deal? The flu kills, tens of thousands of people, and we've been fine with it for years and years. Here's the thing, exponentials accelerate. And so by the time we get to late March, early April, we're gaining 100,000 cases every 3 days. And if you don't intervene, soon you're gaining 100,000 cases every 3 hours. That's the tyranny of exponentials. And again, most of us just don't have experience, so we tend to make linear mistakes. Now, let's keep going. So, mission number 1, flatten the curve. I'm pleased to declare a success on that. New York and New Jersey had a much tougher time because you went slightly above the healthcare system capacity. Nowhere else in the country did. A lot of places, the hospitals never came close to capacity. We never used up the ICUs. We never used up the ventilators in almost any state outside of your area. Now, let's all go back to the old normal because we flattened the curve. It's still going to take N days to get down the curve, and I'm going to give you that answer here in a minute. So we're not done. We just went past the peak and we're coming down. So go back to the old normal. Well, what we would be doing is restarting this exponential fire, not with one case in one state, but multiple cases in all 50 states. And then you got to ask yourself this question. what would cause the virus, SARS-CoV-2, to behave differently the second time? And the answer is nothing. Probably nothing. Now, I'll give you the 5 things we're going to watch for, but probably nothing. And that's why I conclude distance is with us for a while. Now, what to do? So let's just lay this one out, and then I'll come back and loop all around on the numbers, and we'll get into the, what led me to these conclusions. We know what we've got. Now is the new normal. Of course, in the future, there should be fewer cases, so we can do testing and contact tracing. It'll be a little less dangerous, but it's basically the same issue. So redesign the business now. And the reason you're looking at backward letters there is because we're inside your business looking out. And these are the 3 imperatives. Number 1, in your business and with all external contact points, you've got to come up with a way to achieve virtually flawless social distancing throughout the business for the rest of this year. Now, there are ways to do that without a physical 6 feet. And so I'll just point out 2. Plexiglass between people achieves a virtual distancing. N95 masks worn by 2 people achieves a virtual social distancing. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical 6 feet, but we're going to have to figure that one out. Number 2, surfaces are a problem. We're going to look at New England Journal of Medicine study in a minute. SARS-CoV-2 is viable on plastic and stainless steel for 72 hours, 3 days. And so we have to have an operation where we do not have 2 people touch the same surface within some period of time. If it's cardboard, you're probably safe after 24 hours, according to New England Journal of Medicine. Same thing with paper. But even cardboard and paper are not safe in the beginning. And then finally, think about this. If the kids aren't in traditional classrooms, they may be at home doing distance learning. I can tell you, an employee who has a 5-year-old in the house, there is no better productivity destroyer than that. And even if we figure out some way by looking to Sweden and looking to Denmark and what they're doing right now, and we find a way to get the kids back into socially distanced classrooms, we still have the summer. That's 3 months where kids are not going to be in summer camp. So how about we try to help our employees figure out how to be more productive in their homes, maybe by setting up partitioned workspaces, maybe by subsidizing in-home childcare for single-parent households, maybe by coaching 2-parent households to have a discussion about kid handoffs. So to me, those are the 3 imperatives. With that, I want to pause for a second because that's the basic proposition before I take you back into the data. Comments, questions, observations, challenges, please. I'm going to keep rolling then. You want to jump in? Let me know. By the way, Bill Gates probably spent more time and money from his foundation working on pandemics than any person on the planet. A couple of Fridays ago, April 10th, this is when the COVID-19 pandemic will end according to Bill Gates. If, and that's a really important condition, if all the necessary interventions are imposed, Gates posits that things won't return to normal until fall of 2021. So it's going to be with us for a while. So let's get down to business. Let's adjust and adapt straight away. Here's how. To me, this is one of the best examples. And if you've never been to Costco, the thing you need to know is this is not the regular Costco. If we backed up 2 months in time, every single lane, not alternating lanes, would be open, and people would have their carts stacked nose to tail, and the line would go all the way back off the left side of this picture, and every line would be full. Don't worry, they're super fast with their registers. They move people through with unbelievable volume. But look at what's going on this day. This was March 31st, by the way, when I took this picture. So Costco is already adjusting back on March 31st. They have closed all but one entrance and all but one exit. And at each entrance and each exit, they have employees with clickers. And they are periodically comparing their number because they are managing the total in-store load. When they hit the number, right, you can't let the store get too full or the humans in the store can't social distance. When they hit their number, then they start metering and queuing externally. Now look at this beautifully designed, socially distanced exterior queue. let's not overinvest. We got pallets out back, Home Depot's across the street, get a can of yellow spray paint and a tape measure and let's mark out the ground, right? Improvisation that works perfectly. Customers would probably prefer if we built beautiful awnings to keep them dry if it were raining, but frankly, bring your own umbrella. You're standing far enough apart, you won't bump the other person's umbrella. Make it work. Improvisation. New surface management procedures. You no longer hand your membership card to the clerk because that transaction could transfer the SARS-CoV-2 virus. You also no longer hand your receipt at the exit to the person who checks to make sure and marks, so there's less possibility of people playing with receipts for shrink. Paper, transmission medium, not handed off at the door. So surface management procedures throughout. Socially distanced checkout. So you see the yellow lines to separate us by 6 feet, but how do you achieve 6 feet when you walk by your checkout clerk? Here's how, sort of hard to see in the photo. I'll add some highlighting for you. Plexiglass, right? That achieves social distancing. Why are they only running every other register? Because customers on the next register would pass behind her very close. Now, they could theoretically build another plexiglass wall. Maybe they will, but for now, that's the first adjustment. And 2 weeks later, every employee wearing masks. That is a really good motivational example of business process redesign. And so we all got to get down to that now. My thought is this: prepare for the worst. And if it doesn't come to pass, because one of my 5 magic things happens, then great. We'll be thankful that the world just got easier. But it doesn't look like that's likely to happen. It's certainly not under our control. I don't think we should plan our business on having some good luck. So we're going to take a break. And after the break, we're going to go all the way back to 1918. But let me just ask again, unmute, questions, comments, thoughts, challenges. Fire away, Robert. We're good. You're giving me the thumbs up there. Yeah. Okay, cool. Cool. All right. 10-minute break. So my clock says it's 11:51. Let's resume at 1 minute after noon. So talk to you then. Hey, welcome back. All right. Looks like everybody's coming back on. Break is over. So let's resume. Any questions you want to throw out there before we continue?
Yeah, I was thinking about something, and you don't have to answer it now, but maybe later. But we're dealing with a bunch of clients who are redesigning their workspaces based on doing construction, based on how the new workplace environment is going to be, or at least starting to think about it. And there's kind of 2 things. One is how do we redesign it, but also which things are going to stick. Meaning, in 9/11, there was all this additional security. People hardened buildings. Half of them did it. The people who did it regretted it because 2 years later, nobody cared anymore, and people had short memories, and they went back to doing things they were doing before. So trying to root through what is a long-term investment and what is a short-term investment. And I was wondering how that plays in, or be interested to see how that plays into the current discussion. Meaning, we're going to make long-term investments in our companies. We're going to change the dial and turn the dial on our companies. How long, are we looking out for that? Is there a phase A and phase B turning the dial? Do we try to jump over some things that might not stick or stand the test of time? I don't know. It was just what I was thinking about while I was trying to make some lunch.
Well, so I have a couple of examples I could throw out. I think maybe it's a good discussion for the group to have, because there's some collective wisdom within each of Norma's groups, and so I would say that is a good session. But here's 2 quick examples that I see. Number one, right now, travel is absolutely hammered. It's down 95%, right? It's going to come back, but I don't see the business travel portion coming quite all the way back. The thing is, we're getting more comfortable with this technology. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of convenience being able to present to you from Pittsburgh without having to fly to New York. I mean, not just productivity in terms of time recapture, but dollars saved, which is cutting down, Vistage's speaker costs by half. Half their expense is our honorarium, but the other half is the travel cost to get us there. And so I could totally imagine that for myself, I'm going to be doing maybe 50% of the presentations physically and maybe charging more or getting paid more for those, and 50% virtually. And frankly, I would argue virtual doesn't reduce value, but perhaps I'd be willing to do it for less because there's a productivity gain in it for me. Or maybe Vistage pays the same because they get such travel savings out of it. And so I don't see business travel coming all the way back. which means also lower hotel occupancy rates, lower rental car utilization. I think we're going to find we're permanently changed in some ways. With respect to inside the office, think about this. We actually allocate a fair amount of dollars to square footage that is for conference rooms. What if, we usually use that conference room for the whole team once a week, and so it's designed to that size. Why not instead, maybe 3 out of 4 times, we'll just use Zoom from our offices, and we'll all be together virtually. And then 1 time out of 4 we do, because we see a few more benefits in being together. We're going to get together in a conference room, but it's not going to be our conference room. Why spend on that square footage for the whole month when we could trot down to WeWork, rent a conference room for an hour or 2? And so I think that will change even how we utilize. Now, a short-term example of a change, we've got to figure out a way to social distance within the office until, we've got vaccines or other kind of protection. That's not going to persist more than probably 2 or 3 years, unless, of course, we fail to ever come up with a vaccine for this thing. I assume we will, but I think we've got a temporary change in social distancing and surface management in the office until SARS-CoV-2 is less dangerous. Yeah, so those are the kind of things we need to think about and talk about. And while we're at it, if more of our employees are going to be working at home, what do we do to make that a better experience? And maybe that's like, buying partitions so they can separate themselves from their kids during work periods, and, second monitor at home, or, maybe better headset or some kind of soundproofing. And so those are discussions we need to have now. And I would say in general, don't overinvest too quickly, because, not everything is predictable here, but let's start making the smart investments. All right, near-term, long view. Let's go back to history, because this did happen before. Now, just a quick caveat, I'm an engineer. Podcasting handle since 2006 was the numbers guy, not a medical professional, so not representing such, not a psychic, can't predict the future. But let's go back to 1917. The US GDP, shown here in inflation-adjusted dollars, 1990s equivalent, so you have some feeling for the magnitude, was rising. In January of 1918, the Spanish flu struck in Haskell County, Kansas, best we can imagine. So it started in the US and then spread to the rest of the world. Now, the US was at war, World War I. The Europeans were at war, World War I. And so the press in those countries did not write about the influenza striking the population. The first place that influenza really got press coverage was in neutral Spain. They weren't in World War I. And so the world learned about it when the Spanish press wrote. So we dubbed it the Spanish flu, but it probably came from Kansas. They didn't have a global transportation infrastructure like we do now, but they did have deployment of the US military. And this spread across the globe and killed probably, best estimate, you see the sources there from the CDC, 50 million people. We don't have excellent records from the non-developed world, so it might even be 100 million if you could have actually gotten an accurate count. It was especially deadly if you're between 20 and 40. Stronger your immune system, the stronger the response. Your immune system's overreaction created something called a cytokine storm. Cytokines are from you, damage the lungs. Lungs then acquire body fluid. You die, drown, pneumonia. So you didn't want to be, core of the working age population. 2% overall mortality rate, which is sort of interesting because we think we might have 2% mortality rate here. So let's look at the WHO and their study of China. Now, this is the data of confirmed cases in the center column, all cases. So China had pretty good testing coverage, but the WHO still did a statistical calculation to account for what we think is all cases, known and unknown. Now, in China, there were no fatalities among the 10-year under crowd, but that's not true as we look around the planet today, so I just crossed that one off. It's very unlikely to be deadly to a under 10, but not 0 anymore. And then you'll notice the correlation with age. What you'll also see is this is more dangerous to males than females. Now, part of the difference in China was due to the fact that males are heavy smokers and females are not. That probably accounts for about half the difference. We think the other half is something genuine, biological. We don't really understand the why of it yet, but smoking probably half the difference. But what you got there is about a 2% mortality rate. So if you want to compare this to the flu, 2% mortality, that's somewhere close to 20 times more deadly than the modern flu. COVID-19, according to CDC, is 3 times more contagious than the modern flu. And we protect 2/3 of our population against the flu with vaccines, so only 1/3 is unprotected. 3/3, all of us are unprotected here. By the way, just this morning, I modified this slide because there's some new data coming out of the statistical studies of New York City. We think that in New York, the mortality rate may have been lower, somewhere between 0.5% and 0.8%. And so perhaps there's been a little bit of an overestimate of mortality. What that means on the other side of it is we have more people who have this than we thought. In New York City, it looks like potentially 25% of the population has some sort of exposure and associated antibodies. Stay tuned, more studies coming day by day. But in any case, modern flu is 0.1%. This is much more dangerous, much more contagious, much larger potential population, just for those who like to compare COVID to the flu. I think we've got a developing problem that I've just highlighted in the lower left. If you are less than 40 years old, this is not particularly threatening. My name for that is social unrest, non-compliance, especially if you don't understand the progress we're making against this. We'll look at that and how to see that, and I think it is our job collectively as leaders to communicate this. I thought this headline was sort of an interesting one. Young and unafraid of the coronavirus? Good for you. Now stop killing people. See, the other problem, and this is what makes this virus so insidious, anybody can be a propagator even without symptoms. According to the CDC, they think about 25% of people are asymptomatic. The study of the US aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt, where we tested over 90% of the sailors, had a 60% asymptomatic rate. So we don't know exactly what that number is, but a lot of people that get COVID never even know it. And yet they can spread it, and this is the problem. Now, the first major threat we had was about potentially crushing the healthcare system. If it becomes overwhelmed, more people are going to die, not just people with COVID-19, but people who need healthcare anyway. Now, New York City is past the peak. New Jersey's going past the peak. Almost everywhere else, they never went over capacity, and they're going down. So by and large, in the United States, we can declare phase 1 a success. We're past peak. In fact, if you look at the conceptual charts, we did not go the red path. We went the blue path, and we're now on the downhill side of that blue path, and the healthcare system is going to be there for us as we need it. That's great. That's success. Not done yet. This doctor, I think, put it pretty well. Wall Street Journal, good old capitalist publication. We stay home not for us, but for other people. I personally have virtually zero fear of COVID myself, especially because I know how to be careful. And still, I choose to go out in public once every 2 weeks. Now, back to our story. 2% mortality rate. If this thing holds at 2, and again, I said it might not, but just worth considering, in 1918 in the United States, 675,000 people died. We weren't good at, constraining this thing. We didn't have modern medicine and so on. We have 3.3 times the population today. Just do the math and you can see the potential threat was at least 2 million. It's probably higher than that, even if our mortality rate here is lower, because back in 1918, we were very physically separated. 2/3 of the US population was never even exposed to H1N1. That was the version of the flu back then. So the numbers could well be higher, but shocking numbers in any case if you want to compare to the flu. Now, beware. Viruses tend to have echoes. This happens a lot, and it happened in 1918. So when the population thought they were done, towards the end of December of 1918, they came back together and stopped wearing masks and stopped the social distancing, and boom, you see the echo. So I'm just pointing out this can happen. I hope it doesn't, but social compliance is going to have something to do with this. Now, back to GDP. You will probably not be surprised that with this hitting in the fourth quarter of 1918 and the first 4 months of 1919, that the US GDP ticked down for the next 2 years. What might surprise you is this. With this thing raging through our population, wiping out the core working age of our labor force, our total GDP dropped by 3%. When you're experiencing this, it feels a lot worse than that. But the reality is it's probably going to be on that same order of magnitude this time too. So it's not that the US economy has gone to zero. It will drop. It's not at 100%. This time we think because the economy's faster and bigger, the effect is going to last not 2 years, but 2 quarters. And of course, you have to keep your eye on what happens next, because ultimately you come out the other side, plus 5%, plus 13%. We actually have a name for that period called the Roaring 20s. And so we are going to get through this, and it's going to be good on the other side. Now, just to keep in mind, what misleads us in terms of our perception? This is a survey of Vistage members in early April. 26% of us reported that we are on plan as we envision for 2020 or even above. 26%. Now, those aren't the restaurants and the theaters and the hotels and the travel organizations that we see, right? That's good old-fashioned industrial B2B that is invisible to the American public. And so is this 44%. 44% of us have experienced a decline, but we term it a manageable decline. We made the adjustments. We're going forward, somewhere between 1 and 25%. So we use language like the US economy is shut down. I want to stop that because the US economy, it's not at 100%. I'm not saying that, but it is not shut down. A lot of Vistage members are finding their way forward. Now, the problem is our experience locally as consumers is colored by the businesses, the 27% in this last category. They're getting hammered. It's no fun right now to run that kind of a business. So we look at our local restaurant is closed, the hair salon is closed, the fitness club is closed, the theater is closed, the economy is closed, but it's not. If you want to see more of those statistics, there's a great report on My Vistage. Note the URL I just posted at the bottom. You can go there and read the whole thing. But the bottom line is I think we should stop saying that the economy is shut down, because it's not. In fact, this morning, we got our first report on what's going on. U.S. economy slumped in first quarter. Live updates. Shrank 4.8%. Now, after it says 4.8%, I want to point out something. It says annual rate. Annual rate. We usually look at economic growth based on an annualized rate. The one thing I can pretty much guarantee you is the second quarter is not going to look like a first quarter. It's going to be even worse. But the third quarter is not going to look like the first or second. And the fourth won't look like the third, first, or second. And so annualizing this thing right now is, I think we got to change the pattern. So to get back to a quarterly rate, you divide by 4. And so let's just keep track so far. US GDP is down 1.2% from January to end of March. That's where we're at. The economy is not shut down. I'm not saying this is pretty, but it's not shut down. Now, warning, second quarter is going to be worse. And here's the reason why. If you went out and bought 4 years of toilet paper in the first quarter, you do not need toilet paper in the second quarter. Actually, let me correct that. You still need toilet paper in the second quarter. You just don't need to buy toilet paper in the second quarter. And so that is going to make the second quarter look artificially worse. And then we're going to see things turning up in the third quarter. By the way, I am not an economist, but many of us in Vistage, again, I joined Vistage in 2003. We've spent a lot of time with Alan and Brian Bolia and their firm ITR. They're really good economists that have helped so many Vistage companies, and I've been watching their webinar. Now, I can't give you their stuff, but it's back there on my wall so I don't forget it. What they're predicting, by the end of this year, we're down 1.2 so far. It's going to go down more than that in the second quarter, but they think it's coming back in third and fourth quarter. And by the time all is said and done, and I'm just a reporter on this, reporting what I heard on their webinar, we end up down 1.4%. Now, that might not be of any interest to you because that's an average, but that's the overall US economy. And they are predicting it is growing in the third and fourth quarter, and next year will be a 2.5% gain for the full year. And so let's just keep in mind the reality, because it feels worse than that right now. But those are the numbers. By the way, this is ITR's website. You can see as of this morning, they're advertising an upcoming webinar, Roadmap to Recovery. They're dealing with not just COVID, but also the second black swan, which is the collapse of oil prices. I would suggest it's worth going there and signing up for this. These guys are really good thinkers. I've been watching them for 17 years, and they're going to provide some guidance going forward on the economic side. So those are some thoughts. This is a quote from Brian in one of the podcasts. In terms of the broader market, it's also good to see in our models, ITR models, GDP is beginning to lift off the canvas in the third quarter as consumers not only exit their homes, but that car they didn't buy in the second quarter, they need to buy in the third quarter. And so do the people who need to buy cars in the third quarter. And of course, not everyone who would have been a second and third quarter buyer can still afford a car, but you're going to see the economy lift off the canvas. Now, let's finish the story. The big lesson number one from 1918 is don't let up on social distancing too soon. And so literally in San Francisco, when their Spanish flu cases were almost down to zero, the city fathers said, okay, let's open up the city. Let's have a great big parade downtown. We'll all take off our masks together. And 2 months later, because of that event and similar events in Philadelphia and other major cities, the great influenza came back again roaring. Deadly second time through. So that's one of the big lessons. So the bottom line on the corona, CO, virus, VI, disease, D, COVID of 2019 is this. The key priority, whether it's for self-interest, business interest, family interest, good old US of A, or the whole planet Earth interest, stay healthy. Keep employees healthy. Keep the family healthy, because it helps slow the spread of the disease, which makes it more manageable at a healthcare system level, more time to get to some kind of either medicine that is therapeutic on this thing or vaccine that can prevent this thing, and beware of the echo, because viruses echo. By the way, I was just reading about the Hong Kong flu of 1968. That thing also came back with a big echo in 69, 70. And so you can see it in historical patterns. Just be careful. If you want to listen to or read the whole story, this is a great book. This is where I learned about the whole great influenza history about 10 years ago. I've been re-listening to this. And what I'll tell you is the first 8 chapters pretty boring. More about the development of modern medicine. Skip straight to part 3. You won't miss anything important. The Tinderbox, chapter 9. It's a great read, and it will have a different meaning to you as it has to me today inside a new pandemic. Now, I promised you numbers. So let's dive into the numbers. These will be boring, but I think they're very important. I'm glad I have a former high school math teacher here. First day I took a screen snap of what was going on was March 20, using a Microsoft site. So this is bing.com/COVID. Microsoft is good with numbers and good with graphics, and still I check every day, at least for the first few weeks. These numbers are consistent with CDC, but a little bit more real time. The first day I took this screen snap, we had 14,000 known cases in the US. Then the next day, and these are 7 a.m. each day, 20,000 known cases. The next day, 27,000 known cases, 35,000. Now I want to take you into the pattern here across a 6-day sample. What you see is the very definition of an exponential. Roughly 14,000 cases to roughly 28,000 cases. That's a 2x in 2 days. Move forward in time. This is before social distancing was having an impact anywhere in this country. 35,000 becomes 70,000. 2x, 2 days. That is an exponential. And I'm going to show you this graphically in a minute. But here's the thing. You think about 1 or 2 or 3 doublings, and it doesn't seem very threatening. 10 doublings is a 100,000% increase. And so 14,000 on March 20 becomes 14 million on April 9th without intervention. So it's good that we took action against this thing or we would have crushed the healthcare system nationally. Now, happily, I don't have to talk about that anymore. I will tell you, people point at New York and New Jersey and say, this is not a problem in our city or our state. Oh yeah? Okay. So I'm going to do something that as a statistician, you're not supposed to do. By taking out data you don't like, this actually has a name. It's called cherry picking, but I'm going to do it anyway. Now, let me plot for you, having subtracted out all the cases in New York, New Jersey, Washington, California, a new line. The line will be in blue, and obviously it will be lower because I took out the 4 biggest states. But here's the thing. It's not that much different. As you look anywhere around this country, and you can plot these lines for any city, state, or country, and in fact, it takes grand total, even as we're trying to slow this thing down, of 6 days for 46 states to come back to where 50 were, less than 1 week before. So this is not a problem just in New York and New Jersey. It's a problem nationally. It's a problem globally. Now, I get to skip the next 15 slides because we didn't crush the healthcare system. We're done. We started here. We could go the red line. We could go the blue line. We went the blue line, right? And so now we are past peak pretty much everywhere. Most places other than New York, New Jersey, we never crossed the dotted line of system capacity. This is success. So the next question is, how long to get down the curve? Well, let's look at China. How long did it take them? Wuhan eases coronavirus lockdown as restrictions intensify outside of China, March 23rd. They announced after 2 months, so they started this around January 20, same time we were getting the first outbreaks here, that they're going to ease the lockdown. Now, it took them another 2 weeks before they backed off. And by the way, your definition of ease and their definition of ease might be 2 different things. You in China today have an app on your phone. You have permitted places you're allowed to go. If your phone is green, you're okay. If it's yellow, you're not okay. If it's red, you're about to be arrested. That's what counts as easing, along with masks and so on. But here's the thing. Some people don't totally believe China's numbers. Okay, so I'll give you that. Maybe these numbers aren't accurate. So if we don't believe China's numbers, our conclusion would be this. I guess a totalitarian lockdown enforced by, the tracking that would violate all norms of social civil liberties in the US, arrests, mandatory quarantines for 2.5 months, that was not enough to ride the curve down. So probably longer than that. How much longer? Well, here's an interesting study from Australia. And presumably the Australians aren't trying to stick it to the Republicans or the Democrats. In fact, they're probably thinking Australia. So some researchers at University of Sydney did some modeling. They simulated individual bots, hundreds of thousands of them, that had certain disease acquisition, transmission, certain interaction rules. And what they concluded was COVID-19 can be beaten in 13 weeks with 90% social distancing. Beaten doesn't mean gone. It just means very few cases where it becomes manageable. 13 weeks. So my starting date in the US is 20th March. So we're talking, if we're good, 20th of June, where we really start to have a manageable number. But that's if you do a good job on social distancing. 3 months. If you're only getting about 80% of the people to be compliant, and what they define 80% as, the average member of the public goes out once in 5 days. That's 80%. Assuming no masks, but assuming attempted social distancing with some mistakes, assuming some transmission on surfaces, takes 4 months. If we can't even achieve 70%, it fails. And so look at their graphs. You start the suppression period at day 40, and you can see that it takes a little while to turn the curve because some people still had already been exposed but weren't yet sick. And you can see how the 90 and 80 take slightly different longer periods of time or have slightly lower points. 70% never turns the curve down. But here to me is the more interesting thing about this study. Once they got their result, and they did not write one single word about this, but once they had their result, they stopped the suppression and let the model run. And what you can see when you look at those curves on the right side is they look exactly, especially the orange one, like it looked on the left side in the beginning. And why wouldn't it? If you relax all the rules, the virus returns to its exponential behavior. So we can't go back to the old normal. Now, let's look at the actual graphs that show us progress. And these are the things I would love for you to carry forward. Family, coworkers, community. This is Excel. And I have in column A created an exponential series, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. You can see it there. What you've probably never clicked before is this button over in the lower right to change your scale from linear to logarithmic. I'm going to click that button, and there's only one thing you need to know. Exponentials show up as straight lines on a logarithmic graph. So we're going to use just that one piece of knowledge and look at what's happening. Now remember, 10 periods is 100,000%. That's the tyranny of exponentials. So let's start with South Korea. South Korea, on the left, we have a linear scale. And by the way, this slide I title, "Our Linear Human Brains Have Trouble Grasping Exponentials." So linear scale, 0, 2.5, 5, 7.5. This is what we're familiar with. These are the scales we use in business. Logarithmic scale, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Now remember, what's important is looking for straight lines versus bending curves on the graph on the right. So on the left, very hard to read. I can't tell you whether there's any progress there at all. Same exact data. On the right, you can see that South Korea in late February was experiencing a straight line, at least 5 days of exponential growth. And then they went into hard lockdown, actually somewhere around February 21st. And that straight line, you can see at that point, started bending forward. It wasn't going straight. That is the definition of progress against an exponential. Not evident, same exact data on the left, but you can see the progress on the right. The line is bending, the slope is changing. And as that slope goes to flat, 0, asymptotic, you'll ultimately see the same response track on the left. So you can see progress in a logarithmic before you can see it in a linear. Now, there are a few lessons that came out of South Korea. And warning, this report is from the Heritage Foundation. They are definitely a political organization. I wouldn't normally use a site like this because of their political bias. What's interesting, though, is their conclusions don't sound very much like they are political. First case in South Korea happened the same day as the US, but they got it worse than we did because they were closer to China. What did they do right? They rushed to produce test kits. Within 2 weeks, by February 3rd, they had 100,000 kits per day rolling off the line. And remember, from the graphs you just saw, their numbers were small. They could get really good testing coverage and shut things down quickly. And then they used a 5-pronged strategy: outrageous transparency, robust screening with quarantine, unique, universally applicable testing, strict control over both detected cases and contacts, and then of course treatment for the ill, and lots of masks. So that points the way at what this looks like later when we get this under more control. Okay, another example, US versus Italy. If you look at a linear graph, you could be forgiven for concluding Italy has a bigger problem than the US. But check this out. Let's go to logarithmic, and you'll notice Italy had an exponential and they intervened very quickly. So you got that straight line there, and you're just dealing with a few cases, but it's doubling at a fixed interval. On February 21st, they started their lockdowns, and almost immediately you see the curve bend. And yet when you look at the US curve during that same period before we started social distance, notice from March 1st to March 19th, that is basically a straight line. That is an alarm, that is a siren that is screaming, we've got a problem. And of course, we eventually reacted around March 20th. That's my date. It wasn't uniform across the country, but it takes time for that then to filter into the system. So as Italy experiences a further 3.3x growth, the United States experiences a further 28x growth. That is the tyranny of exponentials as we're trying to slow this thing down. That was very evidently going to happen if you were watching the graphs from a linear perspective. Now, let's look at the USA today. So here is linear scale as we're approaching the end of March. Don't worry, I'm going to update these to yesterday for you in a second. And remember, straight lines versus curves. Now I have to zoom into this a little bit. You can see the straight line running up to about March 21st. And so as we approach that point, you could see doubling time, roughly 7 to roughly 14,000 known cases, 2 days, right? That's too fast. 20 days, you got 100,000% more. But now we're starting to social distance. San Francisco is now in a lockdown. Illinois schools are closed. Same thing in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, California. 3 days. A couple days later, you can see that doubling from roughly 70 to roughly 140, doubling took 4 days. And as we go forward, what you're seeing here is incredible progress, which is not yet evident in the linear scale. That line is bending and bending and slowing and slowing. And so here we are on 4/27, 21-day doubling time, extended from 2. Removing graphics, it's a little easier to see. By the way, just to contemplate, had that gone straight for a little while longer, that says 10 million, not 1 million by April 12th. And yet here is the current graph for linear scale. And so if you are somebody stuck at home, not working, and you're looking at this graph and you're seeing the pain in the economy, you do not understand what is going on. And that's why I think we need to use logarithmic graphs to talk to people. It allows you to see and predict better when you're dealing with an exponential. Now, people are curious, is this thing going to be seasonal? I have just a quick observation. There is no science on this yet, but these are COVID-19 cases in Australia. Australia is hot summer when we're in the winter. I see before they were distancing the same kind of straight lines there. That tells me it's exponential even in warm weather. Not necessarily predicting, I'm just saying that's what we got Australia. Here's what we've got Brazil. And by the way, be glad you don't live in Brazil. Their president, Bolsonaro, he says to people, this is just a measly cold, nothing to worry about. He is actively fighting against the governors of their states. And it is not, therefore, much of a surprise when you have that mixed message to your public. They started social distancing on March 17th before we did. And yet their doubling time isn't progressing downwards like ours is. Still at 9 days. That's too fast. That's too many people are going to die. Now, one more case for you. And I told you, if you don't like numbers, this is the boring part. Sweden is doing something different that we should all watch. I call it distancing light. They have recommended but not mandated social distancing. They have left the workplaces and bars and shops open. Again, people know to spread out more, and so they're running these operations with lower physical load, lower human count load, but they're still open. They closed the high schools and colleges, but the younger kids still in school. Suggested no travel. No gatherings over 500 people. So there went the football matches, and then they revised that down to 50, and so there went the large events. That's distancing light in Sweden. Now, look at what's going on. They started social distancing way before the US, around March 11th and 12th, and you can see there was a straight line coming in, and then it bent, but to a new straight line. And again, people do get smart, but that line is bending very, very slowly. That's more than 1 month data compared to what you just saw for the US. Here are the implications. When you compare Sweden to the Scandinavian cohort, their doubling time is faster. Denmark has dropped to 32 days. Finland has dropped to 34. Norway is over 100 days. And in column D, you see the total deaths. The population of Sweden is twice each of the other countries. And so if you just adjust this, column E, you get the equivalent deaths. So a distancing light strategy is resulting in probably a 4 to 6x death rate in Sweden compared to the Scandinavian cohort. There might be other reasons for distance, for this death rate. There might be other contributing factors, but the bottom line is that's a pretty big number. Now, am I saying Sweden is wrong? No, it might be possible that a bad short-term strategy is a better long-term strategy. If ultimately public compliance breaks down, almost 100% of what's going to happen next is based on our collective behavior. If our compliance breaks down and you suffer a giant echo, it may turn out that Sweden's death rate in the end is lower than the rest of us because of their lighter hand, easier to comply. We have no idea. It'll be decades before anyone can look back and say whether this was a good choice or a bad choice. The only thing I'll say is right now it looks like a very gutsy choice because 4 to 6x. Interesting. We are going to watch everywhere around the world and see what actually happens and use the best strategies. So, after we've slowed COVID-19, think about this. Only people who've contracted the virus might have immunity. We don't even know that for sure yet. There's some suspicion that if you didn't have a symptomatic or a very severe case, you might be able to reacquire. We don't even know for sure if you had a severe case and have antibodies, whether you might be able to reacquire. But best case is only the people who had the virus might have immunity. So let's say that nationally, that's 26 million. That's not a projection, by the way. That's just pick a scenario, pick a number. 26 million people had this. Well, that's 8% of the population. 92% still have no immunity. If New York is 25% that have immunity, that's still 75% that don't. And let me just quick comparison to the flu. This thing is 3 times more contagious than the flu. And with the flu, we vaccinate about 2/3 of our population. So that 65 to 70% range is not enough to stop the flu coming through every year. And so 25% immunity in the US or New York isn't going to be anywhere close. That's nowhere close to what we call herd immunity. And so the bottom line is we're probably not going to have a vaccine for a year. We can't go back to the old normal. It would reignite the exponential spread, even in New York. So some version of current practices are going to be required for months or possibly a year or year and a half. So let's get down to business. Let's run the scenarios. Let's understand the implications. Let's understand the strategies. Let's make the adjustments. Now, just a couple more slides and I'll pause to open up the discussion. Social distancing is one of the problems. Surfaces, that's the other problem. This is New England Journal of Medicine in March. And their study, tons of good graphs, feel free to go read the whole thing, but here's the conclusion. SARS-CoV-2 viable up to 72 hours after application to plastic and stainless steel. Even on cardboard, it is viable for some period of time, not after 24 hours, but for less than that, there's some period of time. And so as we start to think about our business, what are policies and practices with things like our phones? So you go out and about handling your phone, potentially have virus on your hands. You come home or to the office, you wash your hands 20 seconds with soap, no more virus. Pick up the phone, welcome back virus. So how do we deal with cross-contamination? Common surfaces. Maybe people don't need to touch elevator buttons, but how about things like doorknobs to bathrooms or, sinks and flushing toilets? How about this? Your mail carrier, asymptomatic, shows up, pulls open the mailbox, puts the paper mail inside. You walk up, you open the mailbox on the same metal surface, you touch the same paper surface. Was that safe? Pizza, it's fine, it's hot, no virus there. What about the box? Yeah, plastic. And so ultimately, we need to solve this problem too in the near term, which is why through the data and the studies, I came to this conclusion. So let me lay out for you, and then I'll open up the bridge, my 5 key assumptions. You'll want to print out this slide. What could change this for the better? Because if any of these things happen, life just got easier. Number 1, despite the data I just showed you from Australia or Brazil, this might turn out to behave seasonally. If it does, like the flu does, fabulous, great, we got lucky. It's easier for the summer. We might have problems again in the fall or winter. Viruses mutate, and if you think about this, this is sort of logical. Viruses reproduce fast, exponentially. They don't reproduce accurately, so they're constantly in little ways making copying errors. Sometimes those errors lead them to be more deadly, sometimes less. Now think about this. If you're a virus and you become incredibly deadly, you get to your next host, you kill that host and you get trapped. If you are a virus less deadly, you get to your new host and you get to propagate. And so as these things transit through humans, they often become less lethal or less contagious. That's what happened in 1918, 1919. The thing changed and enough people were infected, at least enough interacting, that between the combination of herd immunity and lower lethality, it went away. Well, until the next version came back the next year. We will eventually, we think, have a vaccine. Not 100%, but probably going to happen. We might discover that we have some antiviral drug. And if those things happen, great. The consequences of getting COVID-19 are lower, or we can actually prevent it for a large portion of the population. By the way, back on number 2, notice my paren, maybe it already is less lethal than we thought. Keep an eye on the Telluride study, on the new data coming out of New York City. We're going to learn a whole lot here in the coming weeks. And so maybe we've overestimated this thing right now. Number 4, here's one we can control, at least once production catches up to demand. N95 masks. According to the CDC, if I have a mask on, I am not a transmitter. I am not an acquirer. If we both have masks on and we don't touch, pretty safe. Or once we get almost all the way down the curve and have very few cases, perhaps we can apply continuous testing, maybe even a daily test per employee, but continuous testing along with really good contact tracing. So we're going to hire a whole bunch of people to do contact tracing. We're going to need good compliance on quarantine, not just if you're ill, but if you've been exposed to somebody who had a confirmed case. So if any of these 5 things happen, or if we can make them happen, that makes the picture better. But in the meantime, I think we get down to redesign of the business, because I think we pretty much know what we've got, and there's not going to be any hard or definitive end. We're not going back anytime soon, certainly not in 2020, to the old normal. So with that, questions, comments, thoughts, reactions, challenges? Fire away. Let's do Adolfo, then Robert. So Adolfo, then Robert.
I just want to share an optimistic news that I read yesterday. It's that the Oxford University tested a vaccine with monkeys or apes or something like that, and it proved to be effective. Apparently, and they are going to try with 5,000 people at the end of May. And hopefully, if it works in September, they will be spreading all over the world. So maybe it works, and in September we have a vaccine.
Yeah, September would seem to me to be super optimistic. I hope it happens. But number 1, you got to prove that it's effective. Number 2, you have to then be able to manufacture it widely. And number 3, you got to get it to a huge percentage of the population. And the logistics of doing that, even in a given country, are not simple. And so we hope for a vaccine near term. And if it happens, that's great. But I wouldn't plan on that before I got back to business. So how do I get back to business now? Robert.
Two questions. I guess the first might be more of a comment. The data that you had on GDP and some of that projections and stuff was actually, I think, pretty positive in a way. But obviously, if you, I'm guessing if you are in a business that is selling a product or service to people who are more likely to be unemployed, because that's a number that's going to, certainly be problematic for a while, then, that's a big threat to your business. I'm just curious if anybody else is in that scenario and what their thoughts are about the unemployment levels. Even if you're in a business, let's say, a managed service provider providing IT services, your clients are still around, but their headcount is down, so your revenues go down significantly.
Yeah, for sure. What I will say is unemployment's going to get really ugly, but we will come out of this as a much sharper V than, say, a typical economic recession, right? So there's a lot of latent demand, and people will be called back, but we still got to get from here to there, and that's a period of probably many months. So yeah, I'm with you, Robert. Marlon, did you want to chime in on something?
Yeah, continuing on what Robert said, like I said in the beginning, I work with a lot small to mid-sized businesses rather than consumers, and I see huge disconnect between, and I'm putting it all in perspective. It's more of a comment rather, both question and the comment, I guess. You know, I have one, my firm has one set of clients that says, that, the insulated part of economy is doing fantastic. Look at the stock market. Well, almost at the same level, there's a huge disconnect. I don't want to debate it right now, but, market is up 700 points today. Again, that's ridiculous. Nevertheless, a lot of people look at it and get as a gauge, they said things are okay. And we have another huge client base that are so-called street level commerce, I call them, restaurants, small factories, the car mechanics, you name it. And this is where I would want to zoom in a little bit, in terms of like social distancing. I do not see how a retail clothing store or a coffee shop or how can they operate, period. I do, Costco can afford to put the people at the door with it, a coffee shop cannot, a clothing store cannot, and so on. So this is, I think, that's why I do not believe it's going to be V-shaped. And couple it with our social issues in this country, it's going to be unfortunately long and hard. And I do not know how to advise my street level commerce what to do. That's
what
that.
I would suggest, Marlon, because I'm not representing that I'm an economist. In fact, we didn't spend a lot of time there other than looking at there is eventually a GDP recovery that comes, whether it's 2 quarters or 2 years, I guess is to be determined. But I would point you to the ITR folks. They do a lot of both regional focused and industry sector focus. And so if ever there were a time to get somebody on your team that, really has the economic experience and the modeling, and, they've been through 2000 crash and 2008 financial crisis. And I've been impressed as I've seen and listened to their advice along the way. I think it'd be maybe a time to try out some of their services, or somebody who brings comparable economic insight to your sector, because, frankly, the averages don't matter to you. It's what's happening in your space that matters to you.
Yeah. Dave, let me jump in and comment on that. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, fire away.
Okay. So on June the 8th, we're having a virtual summit for Vistage members, and we will have guests. And one of the Bolio brothers from ITR, Alan Bolio, is speaking to us. And anyone that's on the call that's a guest, I can get you invited to that so that you can hear Alan Bolio, and there'll be other sessions also. And the other thing is, so this is the 3rd time that I've heard this. My other 2 groups had this, and every time it gets better, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks, Norma.
And because Dave and I had this conversation in the beginning that it's very hard to take all this in. It's pretty sobering information. But in the end, what do we have control over, and what can we do something about? So that's what we're focusing on now. And I see that you've updated some of the slides to inspire us to do that. So we're doing that in my other 2 groups. We're already working on pivoting and reinventing. Like, what can we do in our businesses? And we're going to do the same in your group, Marlon. Great. Any other thoughts that you have, Dave, about what we should do with all this for our businesses?
Yeah, I'll give you a few more. Robert, you want to chime in? I just want to pause, give a chance for people to digest and think and question.
Quick question. I don't know if Dave, you or anybody else has any knowledge on this. You mentioned the N95 mask. It seems to be the research I've done that getting KN95 masks is not that difficult. They're not as strong as N95 masks. I'm just curious if you or anybody else on the call knows, if you can get the KN95, are you better off with that, or do you really do whatever you have to do to get the N95s?
Well, I think eventually you want to work towards N95, or personally, I've been using N100s, which I've stocked for the last 2 decades just for, personal use. If you really think about this, we have so many times had close calls with global pandemics. I don't think this is the last one in our lifetime. SARS was another coronavirus you might have heard of, or MERS was another coronavirus you might have heard of. There have been more than 100 that have emerged out of different places in, mostly China. We also had other things that were very dangerous, like Ebola, and every year the flu is different, right? And so sometimes it gets really deadly. I'm not an expert in masks, and so I would say let's read up on that. Wikipedia has some really good resources that explain the differences. My guess is that a KN95 is going to be better than an improvised mask, you know, better than a piece of cotton. All the improvised masks right now are doing, I think, they slow transmission a little bit. They provide almost no acquisition protection. And so, and by the way, even when I wear my N100, I follow the rules, 6 feet and all that kind of stuff. So let's go get smarter on masks. I think that's an imperative. And by the way, now that we're past the curve and a lot of hospitals never went anywhere close to capacity, I don't have specific knowledge, but I got to imagine the manufacturing is going to fill this gap pretty soon. And so we will have masks as part of our strategy pretty soon. What will the post-pandemic office environment look like? Well, Stephanie doesn't say specifically, but she does say this: I don't know how we can avoid it not changing the way we work. And so this is one of the things we think through. With respect to employees at home, this guy, Nicholas Bloom, is one of the foremost researchers, and usually he's pointing to all the good things about this, you know, sort of distance work at home. Now he's pointing at what's wrong with what we did this time. We are working at home alongside our kids, productivity killer, in unsuitable spaces because we haven't really taken the time to design space that we might be in longer than we were thinking. No choice about it, no in-office days. This will create a productivity disaster for firms. And so he advises, among other things, number one, far more regular check-ins between managers and teams. Like, how about once a day, short standing meeting for 5 or 10 minutes, but every day. Maintaining schedules that strive to separate work life from family life. If it's not a 2-parent household, could you find pairs of single-parent employees and pair them together and come up with a solution for the kids, at least for the summer, if we don't have the problem for the fall? And then using video like this a whole lot more. This is not as good as being together, but it's probably 10 times better than a phone call or conference call, which was 10 times better than email. And so a lot more video conferencing. We are going to have this new reality for a while. I call the reality distance. And people name this period right now, they call it the Great Wait. I would challenge that. I think there's no reason to wait. We should be fixing this right now. What is the new business operation in a semi or fully distributed mode? And also thinking through, what do our customers want or need in this different environment? What behaviors will change permanently? And let's design for that now. What are the new tools that would be most valuable? I mean, we're all discovering Zoom and other video technologies, but how about Slack or Teams? These two tools, the latter, Teams being from Microsoft, 100 times better than email. They're built for group collaboration in a distributed environment. And one of the real benefits is it brings all team communication into a shared space, all of it on these channels. So as a key executive or CEO in the firm, you can look across the whole firm to see what's being done. You cannot do that with email. Splashtop, a great app for remote system control. So more technology. Now is a time to accelerate technology adoption. And think about the scenarios. Even if you don't buy that this is going to be long-term, you should at least do the what-if exercise. 8 weeks, 6 weeks, 16 weeks, rest of 2020. And not just necessarily the time periods, but what I call the sensitivity analysis. Where are the critical points or the break points? Those are, I think, the key questions. I leave you with a quick list. This is my partial checklist, and my guess is you probably have worked well down this list, and so I've grayed out the first 8. The next things we're going to need to look at is there probably will be a third quarter bounce. That's going to be marketing opportunity. That's going to be business acquisition, merger kind of opportunity. And in fact, right now we can be doing things to build loyalty in our current or future market share. I've been seeing a lot of examples of this, but I'll give you one that I personally experienced. I thought this is sort of cool because the cost is essentially zero. So I'm not traveling right now. And of course, American Airlines, my primary carrier, they know that. I have the double secret executive platinum status, whatever that top tier thing is for their most frequent travelers. And it expires typically each year, and you have to re-earn it each year. They sent me an email, said, hey, Dave, we got it. 2020, not going to be the big travel year we thought. We're going to give you your same status in 2021. Plus, we're going to lower the bar for earning status for this year. And so what does that cost? Nothing, but it's getting me to think about American Airlines longer term, and I'm going to be happier to return as a 2021 traveler with that status in my pocket. Temporary and permanent changes are coming, probably in your employees, in your customers' behavior. So start thinking through those and designing for that. I leave you with an inspirational example that I got from another Vistage chair, Rick Leckey. One of his members came up with a, quote, novel solution for his $15 an hour employees. This was 4 weeks ago when people were a little bit anxious because the stores are running out of meat. Yeah, so his member, let's keep the economy moving, contracted with a local rancher to buy a cow and a pig and then have them processed, brought the meat to the office, take what you need. What a cool, inexpensive way to build trust, enhance culture, take care of people. Let's be looking for those ideas with our employees, with our customers. I leave you with this thought. What the human mind can conceive and believe, it can achieve. And so now is the time for defining our beliefs. Or put a different way, research psychologist Eve Masita says this: it is our beliefs that drive our behaviors that drive our outcomes. So if we want certain outcomes, we have to form certain beliefs. With that, we are at the top of the hour. There's all the slides. They're yours. I'm not claiming copyright on them. Extract as you like, share as you like. And with that, questions, comments? Just a quick show of hands. I've got about 5 more minutes. How many of you would like a quick Zoom tutorial? Any Zoomers out there? So Lisa's in. We'll do it. Anyone else, either hang with or go as you like. But Lisa, we're going to keep going. Norma, I take it you'll hang on with us.
Yeah. Can I just thank you, Dave, for all of us, because you were only engaged by Vistage to do one of my 3 groups, and then you volunteered to do.
Norma.
Yeah, this is the one, but I want everybody to know that you've just volunteered your time with all of my members, and thanks for all. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, well, feel free to jump off if you want. Let's dive into, this is just very short about Zoom. And again, you have these slides, you can use them with other people. So I often say at the beginning, before we get started, I've got a short Zoom tutorial. But that's sort of a joke because we have started. This is the new technology. I also want to point out, right at the top of the Zoom homepage, access to all sorts of free training and so on. And so there's a lot of ways we can get better. But here's my quick tips. When your audience comes on to a Zoom with a screen share session, the screen is normally set up like this, where the videos are sort of floating over the screen share. If you go to the very top of the window, you see view options right there. I would suggest that you want to switch to and coach other people to switch to, first of all, use the whole window. So that's probably checked by default, but the side-by-side mode. So set that option down there, side by side from the view options menu at the top. What that does is it snaps in the videos beside the slides. And then notice, once you've done that, remember, you can go back and review all these slides, you have a little parallel pull bar, which can be used to change the amount of screen space left and right. And I like to get that about halfway over to the left. So I have the gallery view with all the video talking heads and the slides roughly 50-50 screen share. And then, if there's a slide I want to look at more closely, I'll slide back to the right. Sometimes if I'm not worried about the slides, I'll just open up the video windows almost all the way. Now, notice there are 2 different modes you can toggle between. What you're seeing when you look at multiple videos is what we call the gallery view. You can also switch to speaker view. And so in the upper right, if I click speaker view, what Zoom is doing is using the audio signal, and whoever has the strongest audio signal will pop up to full video. If somebody else speaks up, it will switch the video dynamically. Now, frankly, I like being in the gallery view more often, but you can choose when you go between A and B. Now, I would also recommend, as we talked about here today, that if you're the speaker, don't try to read the chat. Assign a chat monitor, because it's all but impossible to both read chat and speak simultaneously. You are becoming familiar with your mute and video controls down here. I recommend in general, try to keep a quiet bridge. Have people mute themselves when they're not talking, and keep the video on. Coach them to keep video on so that they stay present. We don't want them off doing other things. I already told you about the power user tip. If you hold down that space bar, you're muted. It's like a walkie-talkie. So that's really handy. It saves some fumbling. Now, we have the participant lists. I would suggest, first of all, you set some kind of standard. I did it up front saying I'm good with a physical hand raise, but you also have a virtual hand raise there. So just agree with your participants at the beginning of the meeting, which ones of those you're going to go with. And then I think it's a good practice. I think everybody did it here by default, but have your names on the screen. I can't tell you how many times I've been on a Zoom conference where somebody was using their kids or their spouse's computer and they have the wrong name. If you see that happen, in the participant list, coach them to click on their name. When they click on their name, a button called More appears. When you click the More button, you can rename yourself dynamically. So if people are showing up with no name or the wrong name, you can do a dynamic rename right there. In addition, my other tips when you're the host, place yourself in the frame with the camera near eye level. I have constructed the camera at exactly the same height as my eyes. And I'm framing, so I'm pretty close to the top of the screen, right? So I don't want to leave too much extra space there. Number two, good lighting. Notice that I am well lit. There's no backlight back there. I have just nothing fancy. This is from the living room. I'll get these back before my wife notices I took them, but just two standing lamps that provide left and right lighting. Notice the example on the screen that I've captured. That's if I only have one lamp, right? You're sort of shaded and dark. And again, a lot of times people look backlit. What else is in your background? Worth considering. Make eye contact with the camera occasionally. So I'm looking right at the camera, and I've set up a second screen with all the video windows so I can actually look at you and look pretty much like I'm looking at I'm looking right at the second screen with Adolfo right now, but it looks like I'm looking right at the camera. Creates that sense of eye contact. Keep a quiet bridge. If there's a problem, the host has mute all control. Turn off the screen share. You saw how I did that when I want to bring everybody back and have the discussion about autonomous vehicles. So feel free to toggle that on and off. And then pause periodically to solicit questions and break at least every hour. So those are my hosting rules. Put a different way, the typical webcam setup is too low and the lighting is not going to be good. And so what you want to do is get that webcam a little bit higher, so it's eye level, and you probably want some kind of left and right lights and avoid the backlighting. And then avoid these looks, right? So a lot of people come in sort of the sinus inspection mode, or the rising sun mode, or what some people call the window shade mode. I call this the witness protection mode. So we want to appear better lit. And then home stretch here, I said just about 5 minutes. Notice there is a drop-down arrow next to unmute. If you click that, you'll see there's a lot of controls about your microphone and speaker, but the very last option is for audio settings. If you click audio settings, by default, Zoom has checked the box for automatically adjusting microphone volume. That's a problem if you're talking a lot, because what will happen is they will knock you down and then it will sound like you're too far away. And so you don't want to put this thing at 100%, but maybe I've got mine about 75% with the box unchecked, so they don't knock down my audio volume. So if you're the host talking a lot, make sure you get that setting in the audio settings. You notice also when you're in the screen, you've got video settings, screens, all these other settings. There's lots of controls there. And then just a couple points in closing. Look at your screen right now and look down where I've used samples of 20 or 25 point font. Sort of hard, not very comfortable to read. My recommendation would be if you build slides, use at least 50-point font. I like the 50-point Arial bold, but something big enough that's not too hard to read. And then here's my actual setup so that I can see my screen and the slides on the front monitor. And then I have a second monitor behind so I can look right at you. So if you end up doing a lot of these things, you'll want to have sort of a stand-up studio. As you know, you can see I can move around here a lot, and the ability to see my presentation and to look at you. So those are just some quick thoughts on hosting Zoom. You can share those slides also with other people. We all need to get a lot better, I think, at this technology. So questions, comments, that's it for the day. It's 1:09. Norma, we're done, other than anything anyone wants to ask.
Well, you did such a good job, Dave, that there aren't even any questions in the chat room.
All right, great.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right,
Really great.
everybody. I always like to close with stay healthy and help keep the economy moving. So get it done. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.